Hello and welcome to All the Best Pictures, the podcast where we watch the Best Picture winners from the start and pretend the Oscars isn't just a popularity contest for white men. My name's Sam and I'm joined by my estimable host, Dave. Hi, Dave.
Also a white man.
Yes, two white men
There's
talking
going to be a
about...
theme for, honestly, about 80 or 90 years of these.
It's a good point. It's a good point about when I think there's been like 3 women who've won Best Director since the start, since 1927.
Yeah, and the percentage of Best Picture winners who aren't the directors and stars who aren't white men is also quite low. It's quite a small number. So the whole idea of this podcast is to maybe explore some movies which we potentially wouldn't have watched. Obviously, Best Picture probably not always the best movie of that year, which I'm excited to get into.
Oh, yes.
But as always, we have to start at the very beginning to flagellate ourselves the absolute utmost. And
just to add to that thing, we reckon we can do like one of these a month, that will just drop in. And so we are 96 years of
we
the
worked it
Oscars.
out, and I think it's about 7.5 years we'd be up to now. But obviously, in 7.5 years, it'd take us another 7 months to catch up with the 7 Best Picture winners that
we've missed in the last 7 years. So
about 8 years. About 8 years, I think we can blow through these.
Strap in, and then we'll
eventually
run out. On strap in and on, and we'll eventually run out.
And then we'll just become the usual blowjobby, like fucking just after the Oscars podcast once a year, and that'll just be just like every other podcast.
Yeah, I don't know, and we'll have a problem. We'll have a problem with that then. But until that point, we get to be not like all the other podcasts because there's absolutely no interest in talking about old movies. I don't think, including the first. It's not actually the Best Picture because I think it was called something else at the time. But this year's movie, starting in 1927, we watched Wings, a 2.5-hour black and white silent movie. No, don't stop. Stop throwing your underwear at us, please. I know we're cool, but honestly.
I actually really enjoyed this film. We did try and do we should get this out because no one's listening to this. It's just for us. We tried to watch this as a commentary, which is a format I enjoy. Not suited for every movie, but this was certainly a good format. However, we got fucked by the YouTube algorithm. And I've just said that on YouTube, so maybe we'll be fucked a second time. I don't know.
Yes, they didn't appreciate us streaming the public domain movie on YouTube from YouTube in the window. But that's a story for a lost episode that we will never, like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
18 minutes of that commentary, which is probably about 16 minutes of us chewing. I would have thought commentaries tend to be quite chew heavy.
Yeah, I got to eat, man. You got to eat. So let's talk about
this is a 1927 movie, like you said, a black and white movie. Obviously, we've got like 20 years of black and white movies, and I have nothing against a black and white movie. You can refer back to our imaginary movie podcast episodes on Some Like It Hot, Harvey, It's a Wonderful Life, Sunset Boulevard. We fucking love black and white movies.
Oh, we're so cool.
However,
as we said,
so cool. And again, we'll get into that, I'm sure, in a minute. However, this is the first silent movie we've done an episode on, and not the first silent movie I've seen. And I haven't seen loads, but certainly the first one that we've tried to be a bit more analytical about.
Yeah, and this is a movie set in World War One. So obviously, we're in the interwar years. They didn't know it was the interwar years then, of course. They just called it the post-war years. But everything's the war to end all wars.
Just like we don't know we're in the pre-collapse of society years.
Exactly. Yeah. Except maybe we can.
We're just in the post 9/11, post COVID years.
Yeah, it's all good. Everything's
into
good.
Pandemic years.
Everything's fine. Please, time travelers, save us, please. So 1927, we are going back to World War One, and it's the story of 2 pilots who are kind of like rivals turned friends, and there's a woman in it as well who is top billed and has about 12 minutes of screen time, as you can imagine from a film in 1927. And you might think, well, why? What's interesting about that? And really, the thing that sets this film apart is that it's a film about aviation, and they just filmed a bunch of actual planes, and the pilots are the actual actors, one of which had to learn how to fly a plane. And this was like an amazing
it's at
feat.
this fascinating crossroads of filmmaking history, and we get more of this later on. Different movies, more famous examples where we've got cameras, we've figured out films, right? Fantastic. No sound, obviously. Although,
We haven't figured out sound yet, or color, but that's okay.
Well, I think talkies had been invented. They were around.
Well, 1927 is also The Jazz Singer, which is one of the first, big popularized movie with sound. Yeah,
but it was the new thing. But we've got film. We've got these massive, enormous cameras. They're really expensive. They're really fragile. And then there's also absolutely no health and safety laws, no labor laws. You can kill 15 people making your movie. It's only going to sell more tickets. So what they did for this movie is they just strapped these cameras to the front of these biplanes that they presumably bought from like military surplus. These like 10-year-old planes that probably weren't very airworthy. Strapped these cameras to the front of them. Had these actors who weren't professional pilots or stunt people fly them around, and got footage of that. And you absolutely can tell that's exactly how they did it. And it absolutely works. It's terrifying. It's in a way that, like,
well,
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, and in a way that we don't really appreciate. We talk, and I'm going to mention this now, and won't mention it again, but we always talk about watching Citizen Kane as being like, you watch it, you're like, cool, I guess. It's lauded as like the film, one of the most, probably the best film ever made. And you watch it, you're like, all right. But what you're missing is the fact that a lot of the things that it did were brand new and were revolutionary. And this film is a good example of that, where people had never seen like this. We'd never seen the shot of the pilot in the plane flying with the scenery behind him, with another plane flying behind him. We'd never seen that before in 1927, and now it's a shot that
we'd only really had planes for what, like 20 years?
I know, yeah, exactly.
At this point.
What?
We've had iPhones for as long now as they'd had planes when this movie came out.
That is an amazing comparison. That is an amazing comparison. I always think about the Wright brothers. I think Wilbur, who died in 1948. So he went from inventing powered flight to watching the bombing of Dresden and everything in between. Like, Jesus, that's heady days.
It's crazy, really, isn't it?
So, but now when we go back and when we watch movies now, we watch movies like The Aviator, we watch movies like Dunkirk, which are great spectacles. It's all pretty routine. And also, as you say, we're a bit more conscious about safety now. So we maybe have some of these rigs on the ground that we can move side to side to simulate flying, but they didn't do any of that then. They just put...
It's kind of what I was expecting from this movie, really. It being I didn't have huge hopes that this would be massively entertaining, especially it being a silent movie, because I think that a lot of that translates poorly to modern viewers anyway, and I'm not even classing that. We need like a third guy, and not Ross maybe, because I think he'd just dissolve our partnership. But like a person who is a bit of like a normal person to watch a movie and be like, was that as entertaining at all? Yes. Because we were always going to love a movie like this, which is a bit more raw and is a bit more, you can see the strings, and obviously there aren't any strings because it's all just fucking cameras taped to planes, except they hadn't invented tape, so it's just roped to planes. So it's a bit rough, and you can sort of see all the cuts, and we were sat watching. There's a couple of stunts especially where it really doesn't look like there's any other way they could have done it other than crashing a plane, like literally with a person in it. That seems to be the only way they could have got that shot, is crashing a plane to the ground with a pilot in it.
Exactly, which is just, obviously never mind CGI, but even remote control, like however else you wanted to do this, there wasn't a way of doing that in 1927. But on the filmmaking, I think that it's actually remarkable how mature it feels. As much as it's in black and white and it's silent, like there's a lot of this which you wouldn't feel. It doesn't feel that out of place. It feels like we're still working from the same like understanding of what cinemas. What shots have we got? What film techniques? What storytelling techniques? And I think that's the thing to remember as well, is that even in 1927, like cinema's pretty well established, with maybe 25, 30 years into established regular people going to the cinema type of thing. So in some ways it does feel really archaic. It does feel really like we're going back 100 years. But in a lot of ways, this is like a really well translatable movie for audiences in the 21st century. And I think that's a really interesting comparison. I think this is maybe a good example of that. Whereas there are so many films from 1927 that are shit, obviously, because that's how everything works.
Well, in a way, though, like I think we sometimes have this thing. Oh well, we hadn't really developed you're saying the opposite, but in some ways, we're coming at it from this stigma of like, oh, it's a film from the 1920s and it's a silent movie, and like they didn't know how to make movies. They did know how to make movies, and guess what? They did know how to write stories because William Shakespeare invented writing stories fucking 300 years before that, and he was only really robbing it from fucking. If you go back far enough, the ancient Greeks invented all of this. Homer did all of this thousands of years ago. So actually, we did know loads about writing a story. We did know loads about like putting on a production, and you see it in films like this. This is, I actually would say, not a fantastically overwritten movie. It's hard to know how much of that's lost in the edit, or how much of that is like, I don't know the exact process between. Obviously, all these actors are working off a script. We talked about this. Which would be fairly basic, but it's a script.
Yeah.
But actually, when you edit it, you choose the scenes you want, and then you put in the interstitial cards, the title cards, and that's your dialogue. So you can kind of like massage the movie to do whatever you want to do in that sense. So it's kind of like you do wonder what was the original, like what did they shoot? Because they'll have shot hundreds and hundreds of hours of film. Like what didn't they put in the film?
Yeah, and it's one of those movies. I think that you would have had lots of shooting. There's lots of interesting trivia around like how difficult it was to achieve all of this stuff. It took them a long time to film. It was very expensive. One example being like when they were shooting the planes in the air, they soon realized that unless it's cloudy, you can't really see what's going on. Like you couldn't distinguish what was happening because the distance is, you couldn't have that thing of like, I need to understand the geography of the scene.
Yeah, and they didn't know that because this is kind of like a really early.
Yeah.
You kind of imagine when you're like, oh, it's a silent movie with planes, and you imagine they build a cockpit and they have that like rotating background on like a bit of paper. You imagine that's how they do it. And no,
they hadn't even invented that yet. Like that wasn't.
They hadn't even invented the shortcut way. Actually, this is like, and you can. If the commentary had not been lost to time, which is a real shame, you would kind of hear us go through like, what, like vast periods of boredom because honestly, whenever the characters are talking to each other, you kind of don't care. Yeah. But like whenever we're looking at the planes in the sky, that's when we're paying attention and we're like, oh my God, what are they doing? And I can only imagine in 1927, you've never seen anything like this. Like, and we crib from this to this day, and by this to this day I mean 30 to 40 years ago we made Star Wars. Like a lot of the shots, a lot of the plane maneuvers in this like are reused again and again and again throughout Hollywood.
Yeah,
like very identifiable. Like, oh my God, they're bombing the Death Star, and it's the same run of planes doing the same things, and it's like, oh, we just did that again.
And Lucas stole from 50s movies, and Lucas stole from 40s.
Which stole from this, from 40s movies, which stole from 30s movies, which stole from this.
It's beautiful. It rhymes. And you mentioned the dialogue. You mentioned the scenes where we're not flying planes. To which we're asking, where are the planes? Why aren't the planes on screen now? Where's Poochie? Like you're very much in that thing of just okay, let's go on with it. And this is not a particularly compelling story. This is not a compelling story. It's a it's a very basic love triangle. The characters
It's
aren't that
the characters are.
developed.
I really like Clara Bow. Let's talk about Clara Bow for a minute because
Mhm.
she's in this movie as the star, and she'll be because it's kind of a weird thing where that would be the name that would get you to come and watch this movie, which is actually like a
Yes.
really interesting technical piece of like filming in terms of the planes and things. It's not really a Clara Bow movie, but she was like one of the biggest silent movie stars at the time. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. And she was upset. She said that she was upset. She called it a boys' movie, I think. Where it's basically just these two guys having all the
yeah,
fun.
but it's interesting that she's the tentpole, like you said, the first build, and she's a tentpole to kind of like trick people into watching this movie. And I do think that like there's a reason this woman was a star because she's got this like screen presence, and like the same reason people are stars now is because if you don't have screen presence, you don't have a career unless
Charisma.
you're a friend of Adam Sandler.
Well,
But
there's a great line from Sunset Boulevard, isn't there, where Gloria Swanson says, "We didn't need dialogue. We didn't need sound. We had faces." And I think
yeah,
that's such a brilliant. I've really stayed with me, that line.
yeah, and Clara Bow in this movie, she's expressive, she's funny. Like if you had sound in this movie, it would seem like she was really overacting, like in a quite a stagey way.
Yeah.
But because it's a silent movie, you kind of appreciate that in the body language, and again, it all seems built to the medium. I was some of the scenes she was in, I was quite entertained when she was driving around that little car, picking up wounded soldiers.
It,
That
it
was interesting.
it's also it just feels very inconsequential, doesn't it?
It
Her
feels like
role
two
in
different movies.
yeah, her role in this, and even we've got Charles Buddy Rogers who plays one of the pilots, and then Richard Arlen. Richard Arlen, a second pilot, he was a pilot in World War One, but Charles Rogers had to learn how to fly a plane, and it's like it's just a staggering achievement by itself. And so that's where I think this movie's like there's a lot of technical stuff to enjoy, but it is in many ways a proper like popcorn flick because like what are we exploring? The substance of this movie is actually really lacking, and the comparison I would make again same year is Metropolis, which came out
By
in
comparison, do you mean like the opposite? Like whereas this
well
movie is quite underwritten
yeah sorry
and
yeah
like doesn't really make you think,
but
other than why is Clara Bow in this? Why aren't we seeing more of Clara Bow? Why
yeah
does everyone seem to think she's an ugly non-person who they shouldn't be talking to?
or where are the planes? Where's Clara? Like compare that to Metropolis. Fritz Lang exploring the class structure of modern society of a futuristic science fiction society where
While bankrupting German cinema for decades.
yeah like incredible amazing movie that actually has a point and is that it's probably more literary
It's got more
now,
pathos to it. It makes you think. And it's as
whereas
relevant
this
today
is
as it
like
was then. This is kind of like, oh, this is a cool war film that like you sit there thinking, mate, in 10 years you ain't seen nothing yet. Like fuck, you just wait.
yeah hold on to your
Yeah,
hold on
Pearl
to your
Harbor is coming. It is coming, America.
well
And
that's a good
so
that's a good
that maybe neuters the film in a certain way.
yeah
Yeah, I did think of that is it Ben Affleck Pearl Harbor movie. I did think of that when I was watching this, in terms
oh,
of like this is a better movie because that movie is trash.
yeah
But like it's that same sort of thing. It's like pilots and there's sexy women about and they're flying planes. It's mostly about the flying planes and everything else kind of takes a back seat because what actually is more engaging even now is people like watching planes fly about. It's fun.
yeah yeah and I think that's probably a good comparison to a Michael Bay movie. Like I had in my head Transformers. That's the movie that I was thinking of. Like this feels like because it's technically incredible, and it's a spectacle, and it's also shallow as all sin. And so those two things, it kind of matches where we are with popular cinema now. Like
Transformers is a weirdly like yeah. Yeah, it kind of is. It's like, oh, what's the most like advanced technology we've got right now? Great, let's do that. Let's cast a sexy woman, right? And let's have her do nothing but be sexy. We get that sexy scene in the middle of the movie where we really were clutching our pearls. Again, lost to time. There's a scene where you kind of like see, you don't really see anything. You just see Clara Bow's chest exposed to just above her breasts, and you're like, oh my god,
It's
mercy
it's
me, because you just aren't expecting it, because tonally to the rest of the movie it's like, oh my god. But
it's
it's
a
akin to Megan
shocking.
Fox
Yeah,
egregiously bending over and cleaning that car in those denim shorts. It's
yeah,
the same shot, like it's
yeah.
trying to do the same
You
thing.
can you
It's
can
like,
tell
it's for the dads.
you can tell the things that have been laser imprinted onto our minds, can't you? As we scoff at it, oh, that's just very base. Oh, that's a bit gauche,
No,
isn't it?
what I mean is
But do you
in the
remember
context
specifically
of
the
it, by
detail?
the
Do you remember
time
the
you get
detail
to
of the
that in the
shorts, Dave?
movie.
The detail of the shorts and
No, I just
everything.
remember she get changed.
I
Actually,
know.
what I
I'm
remember,
teasing.
Sam, is that then she's unfairly cashiered and sent back to America. That's what I mainly remember, is that
Take that. Yeah.
women are always to blame if they are caught in, untoward situations. That's the
Mhm.
lesson to take from this movie.
Yeah.
Um, that is a joke. But no, it's
We're yeah. Go
like
on.
shocking for its time. But then you passed it, and again, not being super familiar with silent movies from this era, I don't know how and this is pre-code as well. Oh my god, I can't wait to talk about the Hays Code.
The
Oh my
Hays
god, I've got
Code,
a history cast.
and that's the Hays Code is like the censorship, isn't it? The self-imposed censorship to prevent movies being regulated by the government in the late period. It's quite a funny thing as well of being like the silent movie aspect of this. That's something I think that I've watched like a bit of silent film, but not lots. More kind of like shorts, Buster Keaton esque stuff, and that's where I think a lot of my silent movie knowledge comes from. But it's also
I know it from Simpsons jokes,
scene missing type of thing. Yeah,
Buster
yeah.
Keaton YouTube videos. I've seen Metropolis. Oh, I told this story the other day as well. I saw Metropolis at the theatre in Leeds with a live orchestral accompaniment, which was like, oh, we should bring that back. Like, just you would go and watch a silent movie every single week with a live orchestra. I'd be like, absolutely fantastic. That's like
I'm completely with you. That sounds
intermission,
amazing.
a bar. Oh, now
There's
we're
four-
talking. Now
There's
we
four
are
other people
talking.
out there. Who
Yeah,
are
there's
into
no
that.
rotten kids there, Sam, because they don't care. It's just for me and losers like me.
Yeah, and I love it. And I'm on. I will subscribe to your Patreon to carry on telling me about that. But I think silent movies. Like, I was surprised how quickly you just slot in to. We're going to have a break in the scene where there's a massive bit of they just take over the scene with the dialogue, but also that you don't really need it. Like,
No.
a lot of the ways they didn't include some dialogue that is spoken
Human
by the
brains
characters.
are really clever. So actually, you kind of know what's going on in a scene
They had faces
from the
Dave, they
limited
had
amount of
faces.
context, and they're overacting. And oh, he's upset with him, and you're like, I wonder why. And then the card comes up and tells you why he's upset with him, and then you're like, great, he's gonna punch him then, and then he punches him, and you get to, and you're just kind of along for the ride. And by halfway through the movie, you have adapted. It's not like, oh, this is really hard work having to watch this movie. It's like, no, I'm just watching a movie, and this is how it's relaying the information to me. A bit, I suppose, like watching a foreign language movie with subtitles. In a way, I know it's not a perfect one-to-one,
Mhm.
but like in a way that you can still enjoy it, even if you're having to like read the dialogue.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about, like, how, as you say, how great the human brain is at interpreting all this stuff, but also again how that's translated forward. Like, a lot of the things that we see here, we see now in 2020. So yes. So some other notable things. This has a quite amazing shot of when Charles is in Paris and he's boozing with a lady that's not Clara Bow, because again there's this love triangle thing.
A hooker. It's implied that this is a sex worker.
Yeah. So, and there's this shot which was on like they hung it from the ceiling basically on like on a rail, and he pushed through the crowd. The crowd fizzle out. I've seen the same thing in I think it's a beer Moretti advert recently. Like, there's my cultural references, like, and it's referenced all throughout cinema. I think most recently in one of the Star Wars movies, and it's like, again, it's one of those great things of like cinema nerds going, look at that shot,
Yeah.
DiCaprio pointing at the screen, like that is amazing to see, and it's so clever, but also, again, it feels quite seamless. It doesn't feel like it really stands out in this film because I think of how technically well constructed it is.
Well, I think the technicalities of this movie is why why we can watch it at all. This was a lost movie for a while, which is another thing I find fascinating. Actually, vast swathes of the silent movie era were all filmed on what basically amounts to low grade explosives. They filmed and stored them on low grade explosives, which then quite frequently exploded into flames. So this movie was lost for a long time, and they found an old. Basically, they discovered a reel of it, and then Paramount, the version we watched, Paramount restored it in about 15 years ago, I think. So for a long while, you couldn't watch this, and if it hadn't been a Best Picture winner, if it hadn't been as like technically interesting as it was, maybe they wouldn't have bothered. Maybe it wouldn't have been something that they would have sought out.
And how many movies must there be that are lost? Thousands,
Thousands. I mean,
you
there's actors and directors of this era whose entire filmography is gone. Like,
yeah.
we know about it from reviews at the time, and we always have the newspapers because they didn't print them on nitrate film. But
Yeah.
we lose a lot of this stuff, and it's sort of interesting to dive back in time. Let's not go long on this, Sam, because this is
this is,
I think, quite a devoid movie in terms of content.
yeah. What I'd like to
I just
talk
want to
about,
maybe touch on like the
go on.
best pictureness of it. So
Yeah.
this won the first Best Picture, and maybe in a different year, like 10 years later, maybe this wouldn't have won the Best Picture. It might have won maybe like one of the technical awards rather than Best Picture. But it's sort of like in its infancy, and it'd be interesting to see the sorts of movies that they choose.
Yeah, yeah, and this one. I think it was called Outstanding Picture at the time. It was changed later
Monty
on.
Burns annual award for outstanding achievement in the field of excellence.
Yes, yeah, and it's interesting because I think let's just try to find who was the other nominees for at the time. But I think like the jazz singer. I'm remembering that the jazz singer was considered, like, basically wasn't included because there was nothing else like it. Do you know what I mean? Like, we hadn't seen any of this, and so
Yeah.
it just wasn't on the list. We've also got Seventh Heaven, which is a romantic movie, and The Racket, which is a gangster movie. And that's what I think this era is interesting as well. Like the 20s into the 30s, it's kind of like the birth of the genre as well. We start getting gangster movies, we start getting war movies, we start getting all of these types of films, which I think are now so common. So we don't even think about that. Of course, there's genres, but back then it was a different thing, and there were different expectations from audiences around what was, what type of movie are we going to be able to go see.
Yeah, and also cinema attendance was never higher than it was in this era.
God, imagine what else were you going to do?
Like the radio exists, I guess. Like, so you sit and listen to a radio play. I mean, honestly, what you would do, Sam, is work in even worse conditions for even lower pay than you do now, but only just.
Yeah. Well, it's the past. Everything's terrible in the past. What's rule number one of the past? Always be a rich white man, because unless you're
exactly,
you're
and in this era, you would be picking Best Pictures and making Best Pictures and casting Best Pictures, etc., etc. But yeah, I think we're going to try and hit one of these every month, but there's no massive, if we miss one, we miss one. It will be interesting to hit all these pre-code. So this is the only silent movie that ever won Best Picture.
Mm-hmm.
But we've got like 5 or 6 movies before the Hays Code, so I'm excited to see how raunchy and violent and bloody they are. Obviously, compared to modern viewers, probably not very, but compared to some of the movies we're going to hit after 35, probably quite sketchy
Yeah,
from that regard.
yeah, I think so. I think it is. It's such an interesting period of history of like cinematic history, isn't it? Then the next one is 2829, the Broadway Melody, which is
A
one of the
musical.
a musical.
Really, they really do not want us to do this podcast idea. The
don't.
Oscars seem to have really decided, like, what are the two most off-putting movies to make these fuckers watch in
Yeah.
100 years to make their stupid podcast?
But a year after that, we get All Quiet on the Western Front, which is an incredible, terrifying movie that's obviously been remade a couple of times. So I think as we go through it, like you get to see, I guess you get to see what's going on in at least American society as well. Like what are the things that are attracting the attention of the Academy, of viewers?
Yeah, the way in which the Best Picture is decided has not changed in 100 years. It's kind of like part popularity contest, part just blatant corruption, and a thin sheen of like, oh, we're going to pick the best picture, the most worthy picture, the most influential picture. So it'll be interesting to see how often it veers that way and how frequently the biggest stars, biggest movie ends up being the best picture, like it does a lot recently. Or well, maybe we'll get a DiCaprio moment where whatever movie he makes, whatever movie the best actor of the decade makes, gets an Oscar just because they wanted to give him an Oscar. It'll be interesting to look maybe a bit more into the politics of that.
Yeah, we get lots of worthy films, I think, until we hit, the decade of our Lord, which is the 1990s, that gives us just some crazy. Like I always think, Braveheart winning it in '95 is just an amazing. What on earth? Gladiator in 2000.
There's some really odd choices generally, and it's the 2000 seems to be the peak. Like we're just picking, and not that Gladiator's a bad movie. We're just picking big blockbuster movies.
It's not a bad movie at all, is it? It's a great movie. It's really fun, and it's like half got something to say, maybe, but it's not. You wouldn't call it a worthy film. Whereas I think a lot of the films before that and after are worthy movies, like Slumdog Millionaire or 12 Years a Slave, 2013. And again, I think that's just such an interesting thing of like, it'd be good to also explore, this is maybe just a formatting note for us, like what's going on in 1927, what's going on in the year that we are talking about, and can we try and understand the psyche of the viewership, the audiences, as they, especially during like the war years, like, and the 70s is going to be wild. American Vietnam, are you kidding?
I think the decade I'm looking forward to mostly is the 60s, because it's the biggest blank spot of like, not that the best pictures are necessarily these movies, but it's like, oh, it's all just Elvis movies and such rubbish.
Yeah, we've got quite a few.
It'll be interesting to hit that. I don't even know when we'll get to our first non-American Best Picture. I think it's going to be several decades.
I again, based on one a month, which does, I mean, seems like a bit of a stretch at one a month, but I'm sure we can accommodate that. But I think that's the thing of like, why do we? I think maybe me and you slightly more than Ross, and this is not a disparaging comment at all. He'll never listen to this, so it's fine. But I think we want to do this podcast. The reason we enjoy it is because we want to like understand movies. We want to understand how they work and what makes them tick and what are the things. How do we get to the point of cinema now? And I think this is such a great way of doing that. Even if, as we said at the start, it's just a popularity contest, isn't it, for a specific type of film and type of filmmaker.
Yeah. But it's a jumping off point to explore some old movies and just be nerds, basically.
Yeah.
So join you and the 2 to 3 other people on the entire internet who are interested.
I probably will put Wings and then in brackets 1927, just as an experiment to see how few people download this episode and if we have any response.
You never know, Sam. Maybe some like film students looking to like just not have to watch a movie.
It's probably better.
Well, good luck, because this was useless.
Yeah, Yeah, there's probably better takes on 1927's Wings. Have you anything else to bring on Wings, Dave? Is there anything else that you are impressed by? I've got one thing while you think.
I would just say that it's almost a shame that we don't have more. We didn't have a bigger run of silent movies winning Best Picture, because it's sort of a hard nut to crack. Obviously, Metropolis, very beloved. This is very famous because the Best Picture winner. You know, a lot of the comedy stuff of this era is, you know, we've watched clips of it and we've seen bits of it. But I wish there was just a better, an easier way to approach, like, well, what are the 10 best silent movies I should be sitting and watching? You know, that I would, you know, that I can sit and enjoy and hold up. And there just doesn't seem to be a huge amount of interest in that.
Yeah. We could watch a film that's not, you know, just for fun, and we could subject Ross to watch it on the.
And I do frequently.
You'll kill the podcast dead doing that. But the thing that I just want to appreciate is the score in this, the music, which I've listened to subsequently, just as a, you know, again, more nerd levels. Amazing score, really, really good. And what we're listening to, obviously, there isn't a way for it to be included as sound on the reel that would have heard. So you would have had a orchestra performing this, you know, in the theatre, in the pit. And I think listening now, it's again interesting to see how we have the same musical language that's translated, you know, all the way back from like Holst, The Planets, Turn of the Century type of music, skip again to 1927, and then further to John Williams. It's the same. Yeah, it's the same language that we're listening to, and so what we're listening to is a restored version of, I think, the original notes by Zamenhof, the composer. Yeah. I think that's just really cool to be like experiencing it as people at the time experienced it.
Yeah, with less human lice, for sure.
Yes. Yeah. But I think that's probably the case. Other than
the smell must be much improved these days. I can only imagine the smell of a 1920s cinema. The smoke, my God, the smoke. Everyone smokes. The children smoke. The pregnant women smoke twice as much. They're smoking for 2.
Literally medical advice at the time. It's just, yep. Yeah, that's how far back we are.
But no, it'll be fun to hit back in a month and watch the next movie on our list. A musical film.
Yes.
That's also really long, I believe.
It is 100 minutes, so that's not too bad.
That's all right. That's okay.
That's not too bad. Had a budget of 379,000 and made 4.4 million. Compare that to Wings, which was a budget of 2 million and made 3.8. So we are going to see a very different type of movie, I think, when we watch next time, The Broadway Melody from 1929.
I'm already decided I don't care.
Talking, singing,
that's a
dancing.
Bad start. It's a bad start to the podcast. Anyway, Let's get out of here. We've got more podcasts to record.
Yeah. See
Back
you next
to the
time.
podcast mine.
Such a taskmaster.